Good evening. My name is Megan Castillo. I'm the program manager at Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of the staff at Town Hall and our friends at Third Place Books, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's presentation with Nolan Gray and Sean Scott. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We are so glad that you're joining us tonight. The program will run about 60 minutes, including Q&A. To submit your own question, please enter meet.ps/gray or scan the QR code on the screen with your smartphone. We'll drop this link in the chat as well, and you can submit a question at any time. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. One last reminder, if you'd like to view the program with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming events include Michael Mandelbaum and Jacqueline Miller, who will discuss how America became the world's sole hyperpower. And a little later this month, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi talks about how we can create an anti-racist world where children can grow and thrive. Visit our website to see the full calendar and join our mailing list to stay in touch. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civic Series is supported by Real Networks Foundation and True Brown Foundation. Town Hall is also a member-supported organization, and I'd like to thank all of our members who are joining us. If you share our belief that Seattle is energized and empowered by questions of politics, science, and culture, please consider supporting us by becoming a member yourself. Finally, you'll want to go even deeper into tonight's topic with your own copy of Gray's book, Arbitrary Lines. Pick up your copy from our friends at Third Place Books by using the link in the chat. Nolan Gray is a professional city planner and an expert in urban land use regulation. He is currently completing a PhD in urban planning at the University of California, Los Angeles. Gray previously worked on the front lines of zoning as a planner in New York City. He now serves as an affiliated scholar with the Marcellus Center at George Mason University, where he advises state and local policymakers on land use policy. Gray is a contributor to Market Urbanism and a widely published author with work appearing in outlets such as The Atlantic, Bloomberg City Lab, and The Guardian. He lives in Los Angeles, California, and is originally from Lexington, Kentucky. Sean Scott is a Seattle-based writer and historian, a former Pramila Jayapal staffer and Bernie Sanders 2020 Washington State Field Director. He is currently the policy lead at the statewide Poverty Action Network. His essays about popular culture and late capitalism have appeared in Sports Illustrated, The Guardian, and Jacob magazine. He is the author of the paperback Millennials and the Moments That Made Us, A Cultural History of the U.S. from 1982 to present, and the forthcoming hardcover from UW Press, Heartbreak City, Sports and the Progressive Movement in Urban America. Please join me in welcoming Sean Scott and Nolan Gray.
Awesome. Megan, thank you so much for the introduction, Nolan. It's really good to be with you. I think you've written a book that has really far-reaching implications for the way that city dwellers live. I think that zoning is really an issue that activists and policymakers have been paying pretty close attention to over the last 2 decades or so. And it's because of their work, I think, that a lot of folks are just discovering just how unfair restrictive zoning has made many American cities. In talking with others about this issue, I've really found that zoning kind of resonates with the term zoning, that is, resonates a lot with specialists and with subject area experts, but that everybody generally understands what an apartment ban is. So my first question is really just kind of around, when we discuss zoning and what you call the arbitrary lines that demarcate and segregate our cities, what's really on the line for this discussion? And if you're talking to somebody about why they need to be really passionate about how their city is zoned, how urban planners have zoned their city, both historically and how that is upheld, what is really on the line with that discussion?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first, thanks to Town Hall Seattle for having us, and thanks so much, Sean. It's a pleasure to be talking with you. Zoning it's interesting, right? Because in one respect, it's an incredibly boring topic, right? Like when I first started getting interested in zoning, it's the type of thing that if you mention that you work on zoning at a party, you might as well say, like, I'm an accountant, right? But we're now living in this moment where you see zoning, on the opinion pages of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Presidential candidates are expected to have a stance on zoning. You can't turn on local news or open a local newspaper without reading about a zoning fight. And so we're really living in this interesting and new moment where I think a lot of people are thinking about zoning for the first time. And part of the reason I wanted to write the book is that I found that a lot of these conversations about zoning happened without the participants, to my mind, having a very clear sense of what zoning was. And that's not to judge anyone. I mean, it's a very obtuse and difficult subject, and I would say deliberately so. But zoning, basically, we can think of it as doing two things. So the first is zoning breaks out the city into zoning districts that have allowed uses within each district. So at a high level, right, it's breaking out the city into districts where you can have residential, commercial, and industrial. But then, of course, in many cities, those uses get much more fine grained, right? So in a city like Seattle, there might be zones that only allow large single family homes within the residential umbrella, and then districts that maybe allow more affordable multifamily housing typologies or manufactured housing. Or the same with commercial. You might have a lot of different commercial distinctions that say, okay, you can have a cell phone store here and a barber shop there. So that's kind of the first big part of zoning, is it's trying to segregate the city based on these different land uses. The second part is density control. So a lot of what zoning does is saying not only what type of use you can build in any particular lot, but also to what density. So a pretty obvious example that most people are familiar with is height limits, right? So zoning will tell you how tall you can build, but zoning will also in many cases just say exactly how much floor area you can build on a lot. And as I argue in the book, and hopefully we're going to talk about, from these seemingly kind of innocuous rules has emerged a system that I think has basically really harmed the American city.
Right. So I'm talking to you from Seattle, Washington, where almost exactly a century ago, our current zoning regime was devised by the Seattle Municipal Plans Commission in collaboration with a known segregationist named Harlan Bartholomew. The result a century later is that it's illegal to build affordable housing in or around about, or apartments of any kind, I should say, in about 2/3 of the city. Other zoning codes have been implemented to similar results in urban America. Why were cities ever designed this way? What was the intent behind, and what is presently the intent you think behind upholding restrictive zoning regimes throughout the country? I guess we can talk, you talked a little bit about the what with respect to zoning, but I want to get into it with you a little bit about the why.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, when I went to planning school and took the exam that planners have to sit for, they're testing you for like this planning, not like the accepted mythology of planning, right? I always like to say the AICP, the American Institute of Certified Planners, right? There's this planning mythology of zoning, right? Which is, cities in the early 20th century were really, really bad, and there was overcrowding, and factories were opening up in residential areas. And, to a certain extent, cities absolutely had major problems back then. But the planning mythology says then zoning comes in and fixes it, right? Zoning was mainly about keeping industry out of residential areas, or zoning was just about rationalizing growth. But exactly to your point about Seattle, if you really dig into the origins of a lot of these codes, in many cases, the origin story is a lot more complex and not for the better, right? So you mentioned Harlan Bartholomew. He was a kind of one of these early planning consultants who went from city to city writing a lot of these codes. And there were a lot of other consulting firms like it. But in many cases, what cities were doing were responding to the Supreme Court making explicitly racial zoning illegal. So in I believe 1917, the Supreme Court case Buchanan v. Worley says to, in this case, the city of Louisville, which had adopted a kind of zoning code that explicitly said African Americans could not sell to white buyers on predominantly black blocks and vice versa. And so they tried to say, oh, well, this is totally race blind. A black family on a predominantly black block can't sell to a white family and vice versa. So we're just trying to keep we're not discriminating against anyone in particular. Of course, thankfully, the Supreme Court saw through that and overturned it. But what this did was this sent cities scrambling for a new mechanism to try to entrench and enforce racial segregation. And so you start getting a lot of these zoning codes that look, in many cases, are the origins of the codes that these cities still have on the books, or very lightly modified versions of those codes. And so, for example, in the book, I highlight New York City and Berkeley, which are two of the first zoning codes adopted in the United States. I'll mainly focus here on the Berkeley case. So Berkeley is interesting because it looks much more like a modern zoning code. It has what we call single family zoning, or they basically say, within like 70 to 80% of the city, apartments are not allowed. And Berkeley's also very interesting because if you look at some of the early promotional documents for zoning in Berkeley, they'll say, we need to adopt zoning to keep industry out of our neighborhoods. And you read that as, with modern eyes, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, like, like smokestacks, right? Like oil refineries, like what are they worried about? And then they, when they say, well, these are the industries we're worried about, they're talking about like Chinese laundries, right? So even the applications that to a modern eye look kind of plausibly acceptable, there was this, it was of course tended to, as so much policymaking is in the US, by race. And I think, as you mentioned, these codes in many cases persist. And I think that in some cases, the more obvious, the more overtly segregationist elements of these codes have been toned down, in some cases not. But the effect is still there, right? These still play a huge role in determining who can live where. And instead of doing it through directly, for example, having racial zoning, they say, well, if you can't afford a house of this size, then you're not allowed to live in this neighborhood. Of course, that has exclusionary effects on the basis of class, which in the American context has racial implications.
Absolutely. I would hope that most people that are sort of joining us, and listening to our chat and listening to you talk about your book and the research that you've done would agree that segregation is unjust, that restricting the supply of affordable housing is wrong, and that we need to reduce carbon emissions by giving folks more housing options, maybe closer to dense city districts where people work, and would agree generally that those are the right things to do. And yet, in every major city, you have, especially in Seattle, you have a very loud contingent of people who are in favor of maintaining the zoning status quo. They believe that more housing options would destroy the character of certain neighborhoods. They use federal landmark designations to prevent new development, and they are fixtures at city council hearings, and consider themselves to be grassroots activists. So how would you, given everything that you've sort of laid out and that and that you argue against in Arbitrary Lines, how would you sort of characterize this movement, and how would you respond to some of their central contentions about why restrictive zoning needs to be upheld?
Yeah, so there's a really fantastic book that I talk about in my book, which you should also go buy, called Neighborhood Defenders, right? And it's studying this exact phenomenon, right, of these people who seem to dedicate their lives to stopping things from happening, right? Especially affordable housing in many contexts, and they've kind of done the really interesting legwork of figuring out, who are these people, right? Who comes to zoning meetings and has their preferences written into zoning law. And it probably won't surprise you to learn that it's not the working single mothers. It's not the family where, both parents are working 60 hours a week to keep food on the table. It's generally people who are, own their own home, have a lot of free time, people who generally are retired and have higher income and higher human capital, right? In many cases, it'll be retired attorneys or retired architects who feel like they have an obligation to protect their neighborhood. And I think they, it's interesting because if you talk to these people, right, they're normal, decent people. They think that they're really protecting their neighborhood from threats, right? I'm not meaning to cast anyone in this equation as evil, but the problem is that the cumulative impact of stopping a fourplex here or stopping a low-income housing project there, when you add all that up, you get cities that are just basically completely unaffordable and in many cases quite segregated. And I think you ask a really, really important question there, which is, how do you talk to that person? I would say, I think in many cases, you can point to comparable neighborhoods, right? So, for example, in my hometown of Lexington, there's a beloved inner suburban neighborhood that's a mixture of single family homes and small apartment buildings and duplexes. And there's even corner groceries. And, you ask the average person way out in the suburbs, what's your favorite neighborhood in the city? And they'll say, oh yeah, I love that neighborhood. That, I wish we had a corner grocery here. Or like, oh, I like how interesting and eclectic it is. And then you're like, well, it's actually illegal to build a corner grocery in your neighborhood, and it would be illegal to build a duplex or a fourplex. So if you want to retire in your neighborhood and downsize, you basically have to leave. I think people start to get it when you actually show, hey, lifting some of these restrictions isn't the end of the world, right? Yeah, I guess it's scary. It's sometimes scary when people who aren't like you are around you, but you'll quickly find that everyone's a human, right? And to not to go full kumbaya. I mean, a lot of the research too is like there's pretty compelling evidence that for example, people come in and say, oh, this, if we allow income restricted housing, it's going to cause crime. There's no evidence of that. People say, oh, if you build a low income housing tax credit development near me, it's going to lower my property value. No real evidence of that. But I would say that the real way to approach it is, what would it look like if we lifted some of these restrictions? And people know these neighborhoods and they like these neighborhoods generally, and they realize that it's not the end of the world if you have a corner grocery within walking distance of your home.
Right, absolutely. So Nolan, the title of your book, Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. One of the things that I appreciated most in reading through it, particularly in chapter 9, The Great Unzoned City, is that you're focusing not just on the negatives and the negative ramifications of how our cities are zoned and planned, but also outlining affirmative examples that will resonate with people and talk about, the nice things that we can have if our cities were not zoned in such a way. So could you paint a picture of what the great unzoned city looks like, knowing that in your book, you sort of use, I think, Houston as as one example, right, of, what a great unzoned city looks like, and what's the closest, you think, with that example and others that we have come in the United States to the great unzoned city?
Yeah, so I talk about Houston in the book. Houston's really interesting because Houston is the one major American city that didn't adopt zoning. Now, using Houston as an example, of course, I want to caution, right? Houston made just about every other planning mistake that you could have made in the 20th century, right? Houston did urban freeways, they widened their roads, they built their city around cars. They did things that like basically every other US city did. But as I argue in the book, they didn't make one mistake, right? They didn't adopt zoning. And the reasons for that are actually kind of interesting. They were the only city to actually put zoning to a citywide referendum. They did this 3 times, and it failed all 3 times. Mm-hmm. And it failed primarily because of a racial coalition of working class voters basically saw what this was going to do, right? This was going to put up barriers around higher income areas. It was going to make the mixed income neighborhoods, the mixed income, mixed use neighborhoods that they lived in many cases illegal. And they voted it down 3 times. But so, as I say, right, there's a lot that Houston needs to improve on and that Houston's not a model for. I would say in many cases, a city like Seattle actually is doing really, really well on some of the transportation planning stuff. Could do better, right? But better than Houston, better than LA, where I'm living. But some of the benefit that you get from this is that it's very easy for Houston to reinvent itself, right? It's not subject to this 100-year-old code that's enforcing the preferences of people from the 40s, upper middle class preferences of people in the 40s or 50s, right? If you go back and look at those zoning codes that they almost adopted, it would have done what almost every other city did and had something like 70 to 80% of the city restricted to single family homes. Mm-hmm. But so as a result of this, Houston is able to remake itself in accordance with, changing needs. So for example, over the last 20 to 30 years, the city has engaged in a lot of infill development, a lot of townhouse development. So taking that 1950s ranch style home and turning it into 3 townhouses, taking old industrial lots or parking lots and turning them into apartments over shops. Projects that in a zone city would have been a huge ordeal, would have been a huge raucous political fight, right? I mean, just look at Austin nearby. They've been trying to change their zoning code for something like a decade, and it's looking like it might not even happen. But so I say, kind of as a result of this, Houston is one of the most affordable and also the most diverse major city in the US. Because they're able to reinvent themselves and add new housing and recreate neighborhoods to reflect changing needs, they've remained much more dynamic and accessible than a lot of cities, for example, on the coasts.
Absolutely. So in your book, you use the word abolition in reference to abolishing some of the restrictive zoning codes that exist in many non-Houston cities, right? It's a term that I think more and more folks, as far as abolition, have come to be familiar with over the last a couple of years in reference to the fact that modern policing in a lot of cities, kind of, especially Boston, grew out of local police forces that were tasked with returning African Americans who escaped the Jim Crow South to slavery. Can you talk a little bit more about the racist intent and impact of zoning? You touched on it a little bit earlier. Talk a little bit about why you are, I think it would be fair to say you're definitely somebody who's not talking about reforming zoning and nipping and tucking at the edges, and also about sort of the general use of the term abolition in the context of urban planning and how that has been received in discussions that you've had maybe about your book or in your research over the last couple of years in specific.
Yeah, well, that's a really great question, and yeah, the decision to use that word was very deliberate, right? Abolition, of course, it's an incredibly loaded term and with an incredible pedigree. I use that in part as a straightforward statement of what I think we need to be doing, right? I'm not opposed to reforms that make zoning less bad. We're in this moment where there's a lot of opportunity to do that, right? And you have, I think, really diverse groups all over the country that are succeeding in getting rid of things like single family zoning, or getting rid of things like minimum parking requirements, or lowering minimum lot sizes. And if that's a possible reform, absolutely go for it. But in terms of creating like a long-term situation where we don't just revert back to the status quo, I think we need to have a bigger conversation, right? There's a reason, like, zoning got the way it is for certain reasons that probably aren't going to change, right? So what happened? Like, we're in this moment now where I think we're very attuned to issues of housing affordability and issues of racial inequality, and we're having conversations about it. But these moments don't last forever, right? And I think when these moments pass, if the institutions that allowed for example, the segregation that we have today are still in place, but are maybe slightly less bad momentarily, there's every chance that they go back to being the way they were. And so, I think that's sort of the broader case for zoning abolition, which we can talk about. But I think I want to touch on this question of word choice. I mean, I see this really as a continuation of a process that we've been talking about since, OG abolition, right?
Okay.
We're talking about mending, I think, some of these harms that have been committed in the past and righting some of the crimes of history. And I think that reckoning with zoning is absolutely crucial to that, because it was the keystone, in addition to a lot of different things, right? So of course, white terrorist violence against Black families that moved into white neighborhoods, redlining. By no means am I saying this is the only policy that got us segregated cities, but it was a central policy in that sort of network. And it's also curiously the one that we just still tolerate, right? Like, I think we've reached a point where we can condemn violence to a certain extent. Of course, it still happens. We're constantly talking about redlining and how we can try to mitigate that. But then these cities talk a lot about racial justice, and then they have zoning codes on the books that have segregationist origins and really aren't that different from when they were adopted.
Right.
So in that sense, I think it's part of this broader tradition of abolition.
And no coincidence that you start to see a lot of these zoning codes propping up at exactly the same moment that the first great migration of a lot of African Americans from the Jim Crow South is happening. In the case of Seattle, with more and more Black folks moving to Seattle to work in defense firms, and after or during World War I, and the subsequent Great Migration afterwards. So I think that's a really great parallel. I want to encourage folks who are listening now to sort of get some questions submitted. I see a few that we've got that are some really good ones that I want to get through in a second. Nolan, in your book Arbitrary Lines, you write, zoning alone cannot build a building. It can only ever stop something from being built. There are a lot of communities in urban America that I think are afraid with loosening certain zoning restrictions, you'll see more city districts that might be open to private development, and that this could actually accelerate displacement and gentrification. And the response that many others have to that sort of argument is that, more public investment in public housing, which is regardless of what kind of housing you want to see barred by apartment bans, would be one way of alighting that problem or addressing it. Can you talk a little bit more about how we can build more affordable cities by changing how cities are planned with some combination of urban planning and public investment?
Yeah, so I try to stress this in the book. I see zoning abolition as a necessary but not sufficient condition for building a just city, right? So in the current context, I think a lot of these conversations are colored by considerations of, for example, where are you loosening zoning? So if you look in a city like New York City, for example, under the last administration, a lot of the loosening of zoning happening predominantly in low-income communities of color, right? And so we end up getting in these big debates about, where are we going to loosen zoning? And this is, I think, one of the concerns I have about just reform, right? Because, for example, if you take a citywide approach, or if you take a more comprehensive approach and you eliminate some of these barriers to affordable housing construction citywide, that'll open up a lot more opportunities in higher income, predominantly white neighborhoods that under the status quo have all the mechanisms they need to stop that housing from being built. And if you allow a lot of housing to be built in areas like that, that helps you to relieve pressure in lower income areas, working class communities where there actually is a risk of displacement. And that's a perfectly valid concern. I would say related to this too, I think if we ease a lot of these restrictions on new housing production, that's going to do a lot to help with the housing affordability situation. If you get rid of things like apartment bans or discrimination against manufactured housing, for example, which for a lot of people is, the bottom of the housing market, what keeps them off the streets, or things like single room occupancies, apartments where maybe you have your own private bedroom, but you share a kitchen and a bathroom. They're not glamorous living situations, but they've helped keep people off the streets. And in many cases, they're made illegal under zoning. Getting rid of those restrictions certainly helps, but you also need to supplement it, I think, with important planning policies. You need to make sure that tenants are protected, that their rights are enforced and strengthened in many cases. You need to make sure that for that share of the population for whom maybe market rate housing or filtered down housing will never be sufficient, that you have subsidized or social housing that serves those people. This is not my case is not abolish zoning and then we all enter the promised land, right? The case is, let's do this thing that we all kind of on some level know needs to be done, and then we can focus our energies on all of these other things we have to do to build a just and sustainable city.
Absolutely. So one of the audience questions that we have coming in here is sort of, what are your thoughts around small efficiency dwelling units of about 250 square foot apartments and things of that nature? You did touch on that a little bit earlier with respect to that being one solution among many that could be implemented to address the problem of homelessness, which is, I think, very much a function of federal disinvestment from housing that began in the 1980s. So just generally, what are your thoughts on efficiency apartments?
Yeah, so if you look historically at cities, these were the housing safety net, right? At the absolute worst case scenario, you could live in something like an SRO, which might have at one point been a luxury hotel that just filters down, becomes more affordable, and then becomes a place where you can rent by the week or by the month. Again, I think planners over the 20th century took this approach of well, that housing's not nice and it's going to cause all these problems, so let's solve the problem by just getting rid of it. But of course, if you put a floor on housing, you don't raise everybody to that floor, right? Like if I take Seattle and say like the only housing that we're going to allow is 5,000 square foot mansions. Well, I've got some bad news. Everybody's not going to get a mansion. Everybody who falls below that floor is going to get no housing, and they're going to have to move away, or in extreme cases, be living on the streets or in cars. I mean, I live in Los Angeles, and it's an absolute humanitarian crisis. You walk around, and there's people sleeping in cars, and meanwhile, it's illegal to build a new single room occupancy, or it's very, very, very difficult under the status quo zoning. So I think those types of efficiency units are absolutely crucial for giving people, a housing type of last resort. Of course, that's important to have, and we should get rid of zoning rules that make it illegal. But in the longer term, we want things like expanded Section 8. We want things like tenant protections. We want things like subsidized housing that prevent people from getting in that situation in the first place. All of those things, of course, zoning makes more complicated to do.
Absolutely. Another audience question, with a little bit of, I think, some commentary at the beginning here. I think multi-unit housing is fine when combined with sufficient green play space and neighborhood input to design. Can you show examples of converted single-family neighborhoods?
Converted single-family neighborhoods. This is interesting. Yeah. So my grandma my grandma and my great grandma moved from a very small town in Kentucky to Louisville in the 1950s. Leaving a bad relationship and a kind of sleepy town. This is 1950s. They moved to Louisville, and they're basically living in a subdivided old mansion in a neighborhood called Old Louisville. And what happened historically in cities was that this would happen over time, right? Old homes would be subdivided up, as the neighborhood maybe goes in a state of transition, cycles around. And of course, now Old Louisville is one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. And also, if you wanted to subdivide one of those mansions, it would be totally illegal. I was talking to my grandma. It's a very posh neighborhood now, right? Because it's got this mix of like single family homes and apartments and corner groceries that everybody loves now, but it's still illegal to build. Go figure. And I was talking to my grandma just the other day. I was like, Grandma, Old Louisville's a really nice, posh kind of hipster neighborhood. And she was like, I don't believe that. Don't go walking around there at night. Like, she was just absolutely convinced that it was still this, working class neighborhood that she grew up in. But historically, this was a course that neighborhoods would go on. And, in many cases, those inner suburbs in a place like Seattle, and every city has it, where single family homes would be subdivided over time. Maybe one or two would be redeveloped for a small apartment building. Most of them would remain maybe single family homes. And you would gradually get more income and racial diversity and more dynamism in these neighborhoods. To your point about public space, I think this is what I talk about in the last chapter. I think, again, planners have a really important role to play here. If you look at a lot of cities, there's a huge issue with park and open space equity. So, for example, in Los Angeles, lower income and communities of color just don't have access to parks, don't have access to open spaces that wealthier, predominantly white neighborhoods have. And this is where, I think planners have to actually plan, right? Go out and acquire land and create real green spaces that people can use. I think the approach that zoning has taken to open spaces has been to say, okay, every home's going to have a huge front lawn, or every apartment building has to have like a lawn that nobody ever uses and is kind of creepy and is not really well maintained. I think there's nothing wrong with a back lawn, right? But if we're going to approach the question of open space, I think that's better done by having parks in an urban context, right? Planners go out and setting aside parks and setting aside open spaces.
Right, absolutely. And in the city of Seattle, where we have, I think it's 4 municipally owned and operated golf courses and a number of other private country clubs that basically get a huge subsidy. In Seattle, our parks are actually zoned as single family technically, so that's all included in the lot of area in the city that you do not build housing on, or that it's illegal to build apartments on. So I think the point that you're making about generally making sure that those are kind of the climate imperatives and the density going hand in hand with one another, really important. Somebody's asked a really interesting question here. We've talked almost exclusively about housing. what about the other things that zoning regulates? For example, in Seattle, if zoning were abolished, commercial uses would likely take over areas currently zoned for industrial uses because commercial pays more, and there's the potential that we would lose good industrial jobs. So thinking about, what the balances are that might exist, I think is kind of the spirit of this question, just as far as housing being one of many concerns that cities have to balance out, and industry and well-paying jobs for folks being sort of another imperative as well. How would you square those things?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question, and a really subtle one. I think that something that we're actually seeing for example, in New York City, which was really interesting, is we went from having a lot of land that was zoned for industrial that there actually wasn't a lot of good uses for. So people were like trying to build inexpensive hotels, or they were trying to build tons of self-storage units, facilities in these industrial areas. And then, of course, now with the sort of boom in e-commerce, we kind of have the opposite situation where there's the industrial zoning is actually really strict. I can't speak to the Seattle case specifically, and that's a really great question that I'd love to follow up. I can say that in a lot of cities, actually, the industrial zoning is surprisingly somewhat restrictive. So, for example, in other developed countries, you'll see more often multi-level industrial facilities, right? So you'll see warehouses in a place like Tokyo that are 5 or 6 stories, and they've sort of their zoning allows it, and they've built their building codes to accommodate that and to make sure that that's safe. And that's how they deal with this problem of land prices being very high, but you still need a lot of industry. And so, of course, as I try to stress this in the book, getting rid of zoning isn't the solution to everything, and you do need thoughtful planning on some of these other issues beyond zoning. But there are some things we can do to remove barriers to some of the industry that, of course, our cities absolutely need.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the process of putting together a book like Arbitrary Lines, and just the wealth of historical sort of secondary source information that you have to wade through, tertiary scholarship that has been done by folks who have interpreted sort of, zoning and the role of urban planning over the years. But there's also a part of it that has to do with your sort of, I would imagine your kind of personal sensations of a lot of cities, and the feeling that you get maybe from going to various cities. So just talking a little bit about sort of how in your scholarship and in Arbitrary Lines, you sort of mix the subjective aspect of writing, which I think actually enhances an argument, with kind of the objective research and the scope and scale of what that sort of looked like.
Yeah, a lot of the book is pulling together stuff that's already been written, but I feel like hadn't been pulled together into one place, right? And so, when I'm writing the book, and I know you're an author as well, you probably have dealt with the same thing. You go out and do the research and you're like, oh, okay, a lot of the things I wanted to say have been written, but then it's like they're in 10 different books and they haven't been pulled into one sort of thread, right? So, for example, before I started working on this book, occasionally people would ask me, like, what should I read to understand zoning, and what are all the critiques of zoning? And I literally would say, well, you can get Zoning for Dummies if you just want to learn what zoning is, and like here's like 6 different books that you have to read. And so, that was one of my main goals with writing this book, is pulling together a lot of that stuff that's already out there. And in many cases, that's in books that I think a lot of people just aren't going to read. Like, unless you're a full-time zoning scholar, you're not going to read like Bernard Segan's 1971 book on, land use without zoning, right? It's a great book. I love it. I recommend it. It's in my recommended readings in the book. But most normal people are not going to go pick that book up. So a lot of what I was trying to do with the book is distill some of these ideas and concepts that I was worried were like getting lost, to your point about like approaching the subject, I think cities are a great thing to study, because they're one of these things you can study where, it's not like studying the solar system or studying like some tropical bird. If you want to study cities, you just go take a walk, right? Go take a walk, and don't be listening to music. Don't be playing with your phone. Take a walk, and be thoughtful about what you hear, what you smell. What are people doing? How are people engaging with spaces? What are, all these things, you start noticing all these things that you might not have noticed before you really treated the city as a subject. And zoning is actually a really interesting thing to study for this, because once you know a little bit about zoning, you start seeing it everywhere, right? You'll be walking down a street and you're like, why are all these houses why are they all 25 feet from the street? Well, that's setbacks. Or, oh, like, why is there no commercial on this street, but then one street over there's commercial? Well, that's, use districts. And so, this is something I try to do throughout the book, is I try to invite people, like, don't just read and accept what I'm saying. Go look at your zoning code, go pull up your zoning map, take a walk around your neighborhood and think about, what stands out to you. What do you like about your neighborhood? What do you not like about your neighborhood? I think that cities are great because you can learn about them without having that be mediated through a scholar or a writer. You can go out and study these things yourself.
Mm-hmm. What would you say in the research that you did for Arbitrary Lines is kind of the most common misconception that you've come across about what makes a great city a great city? I think a lot of people might have, their predilections and tastes based on sort of where they grew up, what they value proximity towards. But you did sort of touch on this a little bit earlier, that you'll often have, really vociferous anti-housing folks that you turn around and ask them what they value in a great neighborhood, and it's all of the things that they spend their time as civic activists of a kind pushing back against. So I'm curious about just sort of what are some really common misconceptions that you've run across in maybe in how people think about zoning, how people think about, sort of mixed use neighborhoods and things of that nature.
Yeah. I think that in this space, we operate primarily based on fear, right? I think, we have a fear of the unknown that overrides all other considerations. Fear that any change will make our communities worse, and that, if we don't, we should either outright stop it completely and keep our communities exactly as they are today, or heavily micromanage everything that gets proposed, right? And of course, you can't really keep your communities exactly as they are by stopping anything from getting built. If you don't allow housing to be built commensurate to the people who actually want to live in it, yeah, the buildings in your community might stay the same, but the composition of the people who live in your neighborhood is going to change dramatically.
Right.
So you saw this in, for example, I know you're from New York, and are you from New York City or New York State?
Yeah, I'm from Queens.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. So, you take some of these neighborhoods in, for example, Northwest Brooklyn, and, 40 or 50 years ago, they had this notion of, this is a great neighborhood. Let's adopt a historic district and really, really restrictive zoning, right? And yeah, the buildings in those neighborhoods didn't change, but the people did, and the heart and soul of the neighborhood absolutely did. And I think that's a related misconception that I think people have. They have this idea of, I like my community and I want my community to stay great, and I do that by stopping anything new from happening. And I just think that's kind of a fundamental misunderstanding of how cities have to work. There has to be a little bit of change. There has to be a little bit of disorder, a little bit of instability. These things strengthen communities and make them more dynamic and interesting, and give opportunities for new people to come in and introduce new ideas. I think we're increasingly falling into this paradigm where we treat, urban neighborhoods like quiet, leafy suburbs that are never, ever supposed to change. And I would say even those quiet, leafy suburbs should change, right? Let alone a city that's healthy and dynamic and growing like Seattle.
Right. So I think one of the things that really comes across in Arbitrary Lines and in listening to you speak about zoning generally is how much of our civic lives, everything from housing to sort of some climate imperatives. Somebody asked a question earlier about industry, are interrelated with one another in a lot of our American cities. And, we have millions of viewers a year watching big sporting events that are very much competitions between cities. The finals with, a team representing the Bay Area going against a team from Boston is happening right now. So my question to you is this: in your travels and in your research, what is your favorite American cities in three different categories, right? So I'm going to give you three of them: food, outdoor space, and I guess Houston is kind of the housing example, unless it's not. And I'm sure that nobody on the call today would take it too personally if you don't rank Seattle in at least one of those categories, as far as in your research, and just in the process of writing, which examples of cities have you found, were consistently your muse?
Well, Seattle, of course, is number one in all three categories.
Right.
But so for second place, and everyone should go buy my book, by the way. I gotta, I live in LA. I gotta rep LA. I think LA is probably the best food city in America. I think we have just East Asian and Hispanic food in spades, and like I think those are the best families of cuisine. I like Korean, and Mexican are just two of my favorite cuisines. So I got to give it to LA. And LA has this great, just dynamic street food culture that I just love so much. Open space is a really interesting one. I'm going to save that. Housing, I'll surprise you. I think I have a lot of affection for Jersey City. So, just outside of New York City, kind of unfashionable little brother of New York City. But they're building a lot of housing. They're building a lot of transit-oriented infill housing, in many cases without parking, in many cases, right next to rail lines with shops and offices on the ground floor. And they're leveraging that growth too to improve public services, to improve streets, to build new parks. And so, in terms of a city that's doing this, that a city like Seattle can look to, I really love Jersey City. It's funny because like if you live in New York, right, everyone's going to be like, Jersey City, like, come on, like, what are you doing? I always tell the joke, right? Like, if you live out in Jersey City, you can invite a friend out, and I'll be like, I don't want to go out to Jersey City. I'm going to go out to Queens instead. And it's like, it's the same distance, but there's a psychic barrier, right? For open space, that's a really interesting one. There's a lot of amazing open spaces and parks that have been built or improved in the last 20 to 30 years. I would say, I think the Buffalo, just to go back to Houston, I think the Buffalo Bayou project is incredible. It's an entire linear park along the bayou, and it's part of this like nationwide trend toward re-embracing waterfronts that we just treated like they were nuisances, but they can be these incredible spaces. I do got to give it to Bryant Park though in New York. I mean, I just love Bryant Park. It's just absolutely stunning space.
Yeah, I think those are some solid answers. We did have a question actually about somebody asking, are there any other cities in the U.S. or worldwide that you'd point to as great examples of city planning as a vehicle for increased equity, which I think is a really important question because, just thinking about how to make attempts at achieving more equitable cities more deliberate, as opposed to maybe taking a colorblind kind of, rising tide lifts all boats approach, which we've seen repeatedly not go well. So what are some examples, I guess, in the US and maybe particularly worldwide that you would point to as a great example for cities that really have taken their equity imperatives seriously and actually implemented those?
Yeah. So, I'll say one that I think is that I bring up in the book, which is Tokyo. Tokyo is more, I think, key to the argument that I'm making here. Tokyo allows for a lot of flexibility in terms of what can and can't be built. And of course, the city is remaking itself constantly. I read some data point that the average building in Tokyo is younger than the average resident, which probably speaks both to how much they build and how old Japan is. But so, Tokyo is this place that I think they do a lot of things well beyond land use planning, right? So they don't allow, for example, on-street parking, and that way streets can actually be used as shared spaces, which I think is really effective. On the other side of the world, I would point to a city like Madrid, which is building a ton of transit, building a lot of light rail at a relatively low cost. Of course, that's something that we struggle with here in the U.S. But you look at what a city like Madrid is doing, and they're taking, they're basically saying, all right, look, we're going to grow, and we can either grow in a kind of chaotic car-oriented way, and just let developers call all the shots in terms of what our street grid's going to look like or where the parks are going to go. Or planners can sit down and say, like, okay, we want to live in a city where everyone's within so many feet of a light rail stop, or everyone's within so many feet of a park. Paris is doing, I think, similar things with this as well, where they're retaking city streets and giving these over to pedestrians and bicyclists and people who just want to sit out on a patio and eat. We've seen a little bit of this here in the U.S., but I think we're not fully realizing, I think, what our cities could be.
Yeah, it's definitely something that resonates. I went to one of the two light rail stations that here in Seattle we opened just in the last 6 or 7 months up by Northgate Mall, and immediately felt like, as soon as I stepped off the train, I mean, virtually stepped off the platform, felt like I was going to get hit by a car like 8 different times. There's freeways going in like opposite directions, bunch of arterial roads with 25 speed limits of 25 ostensibly, and it didn't really seem like the cars there were moving any slower than the cars on the freeway were. And just sort of the missed opportunity that I think characterizes a lot of urban planning generally. It feels important to me to sort of ask you about how this saga of missed opportunities with respect to building more housing and more equitable cities kind of waxes and wanes with presidential administrations or Democrat versus Republican regimes, if you will, or mayorships in city, or which party is in control or dominates the political context of any given city. Because Seattle is a place where up until recently, the latest round of city elections, if you said that you were a Republican at any point, that's kind of a poison pill against your chances of getting elected to city office, which is to say city controlled mostly by Democrats for a pretty long time, consistently getting this issue wrong. I've never lived in a city, thankfully, that has been run by out and out Republicans, but I don't imagine that it's too much better or worse there. So just talking about sort of the political climate over time, how that's kind of moved the needle or not moved the needle where maybe it should have over over the generations, and just what are some examples of that you may have seen in researching for Arbitrary Lines?
Yeah, I mean the relationship between these issues and partisanship is pretty weird, right? So, for example, in places like Seattle or LA, which are overwhelmingly run by Democratic elected officials, there's divisions within the party, right? Right. There's disagreements among people who are theoretically on the same side of every other issue. So you can go to public hearings and find a Democrat who's vociferously opposed to the affordable housing proposal, and then one who's speaking out in favor. Right. It's a very weird issue, and I mean it's the same thing with the national level too, right? You had Trump at the early in the administration. Ben Carson was saying like, okay, we're going to revive AFFH and we're going to actually do things to nudge cities to build some housing. And then of course, I guess they saw some poll numbers that he was losing in the suburbs with like people who are terrified of apartments, and was like, okay, we're going full NIMBY. So there was kind of a weird 180 on that. Yeah, we have something, I think we have at the national level and in a many context, I think we have something like a consensus among Democrats that, we need to do something to address this. I think the flavor of the solution varies, right? Some people say, let's just allow more housing of all types, and that'll relieve some of the pressure. Some people who place more emphasis on social housing, some people who place more emphasis on tenant protections. I tend to take an all of the above approach to housing affordability, and I think that's probably going to be what the solution looks like. I think part of we're, like I kind of started this conversation, we're in this like special and unique moment where I think people actually are really passionate and engaged with these issues. And the way I think about it is like, what are the policy changes that we need to lock in now while people are like jazzed and motivated on this issue, to make sure that the gains we make now are permanent, right? And that we don't just backslide into this very unaffordable, segregated, sprawling status quo that we're in. And so, in terms of how I approach reform, that's what I'm thinking about. Big picture stuff. How do we get the incentives aligned for cities? How do we take the most often abused rules away from cities? How do we make sure that every city is building their fair share of housing? It's going to vary by city and it's going to vary by state. But I think it's just absolutely crucial that we remember that this moment might not last forever, right? And we need to move quick, and we need to do things that are meaningful.
One of the last questions here, and this is a good audience question, just around utilities are regulated. Why not housing?
Yeah. Well, so something I'm very careful to draw distinctions between in the book is we have building codes, and building codes are very important. And in no way am I suggesting that we abolish those, right? Like we absolutely need strict regulation of new development to make sure that it's safe, habitable, and in many cases, cities, have states have adopted great building codes, and there's some issues, right, that we can tinker with, but absolutely we need some regulation. And as I try to detail in the appendix, there are a lot of other ways we can and should regulate cities, right? Of course, there are some historic buildings that need to be preserved. Of course, there are certain uses that you need to be very careful about where they go in a city. I don't think anyone could argue with that. And part of what I argue about, toward the end of the book is rethinking about what we want land use regulation to do, right? And so I argue that rather than, having these arbitrary use distinctions, or rather than just saying, okay, no apartments in all these places, I think we could refocus around regulating what people actually care about, right? So I'll give you an example that I give in the book, which is noise. Noise is one of the biggest urban quality of life issues in cities. And I'm not just talking about like your neighbors getting in a fight or like blasting music. I'm talking about like honking, or like, a noisy bar across the street that's not doing anything about, smokers out front, or, businesses that are just generally being inconsiderate. If you actually look at most noise ordinances that cities have, it'll be something like no noise that would be unreasonable to a typical person from this time to this time. And you're like, this is kind of a bad way to like deal with this issue, right? Of course, we can have clear standards, and then we can have these standards vary by neighborhoods, right? So of course, a bar district should have a little bit more of a liberal approach toward noise, maybe a more residential area more strict. But rather than doing this kind of weird game that we play where we like try to put every use into a category as a proxy for regulating for impacts, let's just focus on the impacts themselves.
Absolutely. Last couple questions here. Your name is on the ballot for mayor in which city? If you could pick which city you would be like, what? I know how I would go about fixing the issues that are going on in Buffalo, or I feel like I have a pretty firm grasp on what needs to happen in Los Angeles, Louisville. Which city does Mayor Nolan look at and say, no, I know what the people of this town, how we're going to design a city that's actually going to be more equitable there than it has been. Like, I feel more is sort of in touch with what sort of the issues in that city might be.
Well, I would say LA, but we have a history of our elected officials getting investigated by the FBI, so I don't want to be a part of that. I'm still deeply passionate about my hometown, Lexington. It's grown extremely rapidly, and it's sort of a microcosm for a lot of these issues. It's dealing with affordable housing as more and more people move there. It's dealing with a legacy of segregation that I think we still have to right. It's dealing with questions of sprawl. So, for example, in my hometown, we have beautiful horse country all around the city, and people are understandably concerned. Like, how do we prevent that from being developed in the suburb? How do we preserve that? And I think part of the solution to a lot of those problems is more equitable focused land use planning.
Absolutely. All right. And last question here before we get ready to turn it back over to town hall. Are there cities whose sports teams you hate based off of what you researched and learned in the course of writing Arbitrary Lines? In other words, did you find there being a subjective influence sort of creeping in the way that you sort of wrote about and described some cities based off of sort of how their sports team may or may not have conducted themselves recently?
That's a great question. I think LA has probably some of the worst zoning in the country, but I'm still going to be a Lakers fan.
Right.
I'm from Lexington. I'm a big Kentucky basketball fan. And so, of course, our rivals are Louisville. So it brings me some pleasure that like Louisville was the city that got in trouble for that awful racial zoning ordinance. I'm kind of like, yeah, you know, you guys were the bad guys in history. Go Kentucky, go
Right.
Wildcats.
Well, I think Westbrook is doing everything that he can for the housing industry, and Los Angeles with all the bricks that he laid in the last year. Nolan, it's been really great speaking with you about Arbitrary Lines. It's an awesome book. Really enjoyed reading it, and I hope everybody gets the chance to check it out and shares it with other folks, because I think one of the things that was so good about it is just like you said, taking an issue that maybe a lot of folks are not thinking about front of mind, but once they realize that zoning is kind of the invisible ink of how their cities are outlaid, the housing choices that they have, hopefully folks will get spurred to take action. So thank you so much for a great conversation and for writing a great book in Arbitrary Lines.
Well, thank you, Scott or Sean. This was really a pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you so much, Sean, for leading this conversation. And Nolan, thank you for sharing your story with us and for teaching all of our audience a thing or two tonight. I know I learned some more things, so I'm very thankful to be a part of your story, so thank you. And to my audience at home, please remember to buy your own copy of the book through our friends at Third Place Books, and that link can be found in the YouTube chat. So thank you all, and have a great night.